Welcome to the Candice Malcolm Show here on Juno. My name is Kris Sims. I'm the Alberta Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got a lot to talk about on this show, and we're thankful that we can still do that we can still talk about things. Because right now, our ability to express ourselves freely in Canada is on a slippery slope, and it's declining. Here's why. Remember back in shop class, or if you've got a garage and you've got some tools in it, you know those table vices where you can put stuff between them and crank it up, making it loose or making it tight, and it's got two sides coming together? Well, here in Canada, we have two sides of censorship, which are tightening upon people. One side of it is the fact that the government is handing hundreds of millions of dollars to media outside of the CBC. So yes, we know that the state broadcaster already takes well over $1 billion from taxpayers each year, and that the current Liberal government is planning on upping their stipend, thanks to the taxpayer, and giving the CBC more power. That's a given. But what isn't understood by many is that much of the mainstream media is now also on government payroll. There is a motley crew of really weird forms of subsidy, direct payment, tax credits out the wazoo, and there's even a panel, a government panel that decides what is a real journalism outfit and worthy of government money. As a longtime journalist and someone who values free expression, and I need to for my job at the Taxpayers Federation, this is all deeply disturbing. Because, bluntly, journalists cannot be paid by the government. Government-funded journalism should be a contradiction in terms, and it is. The moment a journalist is on government payroll, that's propaganda. The sad thing here is that even if there's a journalist, and I've met many, who's still working like the dickens to be as balanced as possible and as careful, responsible as possible with his or her reporting, the very fact that their paycheck depends in some way, shape, or form on the government compromises them, no matter what they do or how hard they work. It, as in ethics, okay, where there's a perception of corruption, same goes for journalism. Where there's a perception of a conflict of interest with the government, trust falls down. And this is exactly what we're seeing with journalism in Canada. Now, a very healthy majority of Canadians believe that journalists are deliberately trying to mislead them with statements they know to be false. That is very alarming because we need to be able to trust the information that we're being given. Further to this point on the censorship vice. So again, one side of it, we've got government dumping millions of dollars into journalism in Canada. That was perfectly illustrated just before the election, where you saw, I think it was a National Post or a Post media journalist saying something about the government, like criticizing it mildly and pointing out a discrepancy. And a member of parliament of the government basically saying, pipe down, and this is why we give you a subsidy. Perfectly proving the point of people who are concerned about government funding journalism in Canada. To the reporter's credit, she shot back pretty good. And there's also the scene that happened during the last election. We had a situation where candidate A is saying, hey, CBC reporter, standing there on the sidewalk scrumming me, I'm going to give your employer more money. And candidate B saying, hey, CBC reporter, standing there on the sidewalk scrumming me, I'm going to defund your employer. How is that supposed to be reported on straight? How is that not an obvious, almost embarrassing level of a conflict of interest and an affront to a free press? Because the term free press might conjure up images of some old-timey newspaper stand in, New York City somewhere, where a paperboy is, handing out free newspapers. That is not what a free press is. That wouldn't be super important. A free press is free from government. And we do not have that in Canada at all right now. The other side of the censorship vice is the censorship itself, or the potential of it. And that is through legislation, laws that are passed by our legislators in Ottawa. Bill C-11 has already been passed by the Trudeau government previously. It's now working its way through the CRTC, and you need to stay on top of that because it's eventually going to start trickling down and affecting what kind of podcasts you can see and hear and share online. It's going to eventually alter the visibility of what you're even seeing on YouTube, for example, here in Canada. We're already seeing pressure coming from the government in that direction. And the reason why this is really important, of course, is because if you want to express yourself against the government, for example, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we just finished handing out golden pig statues to government and bureaucrats who waste your money. We criticize the government all the time for jacking up your taxes and wasting your money. If that ability of speech is eroded, then your rights are being eroded. So Bill C-11 has already passed into law. Now currently on the table is something called the Online Harms Act. And this is a doozy. So right off the top, there's a big portion of this bill that any decent person would be fine with strengthening. So that's where, monsters who are targeting children online are going to jail for longer, or there's more restrictions on them. Like, everybody accepts that that is fine to do. Unfortunately, there's a strange Trojan horse element of this proposed legislation. And that is the ability for anonymous people to make complaints about your expression online that makes them uncomfortable or feel unsafe. Those are all such variable terms, right? Define what you mean by uncomfortable, right? Because a lot of our discourse can get uncomfortable in politics. And here's the kicker. Folks under this legislation could be fined for it. Or if they don't take it down, they could even be put on house arrest, some of the language in this law. Now, this gets pretty extreme, and people start imagining things like what's happening over in the UK. If we are going to be able to speak truth to power and hold government to account, we're going to have to be able to speak freely and express ourselves freely. So this is what's at play right now. And that's why it's really important to speak with Peter Menzies about this. What does he have to say about it? Let's find out. Joining me now is Peter Menzies. Mr. Menzies is a fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, past editor of the Calgary Herald, and now a writer and founder of the Rewrite, that is on Substack. I would encourage anybody who values serious journalism to go subscribe to it. I just did, and I'm very happy with my decision. I wanted to get into a few things with you. I often describe in my talks about censorship in Canada as we're facing two sides of a vice, similar to what you would see in a metal shop. On one side, we have the fact that much of the mainstream media is now, unfortunately, on a form of government payroll, either through direct payment or through massive amounts of subsidy. On the other side are laws, things like Bill C-11, which has already passed, and the looming Online Harms Act. I just wanted to get your bird's eye view first. As a longtime journalist who writes about this quite clearly, where would you rate our state of journalism and free expression in Canada? Are we at a C? Are we at a B+? Where are we at?
Probably the C range. I think that the real issue has been this sort of decline in the willingness to stand up for freedom of speech at all costs. We're just emerging right now kind of from a cancel culture era.
Mm-hmm.
And what shocked me about it was that instead of media standing up for people's right to speak and that sort of stuff. Now, there's always social consequences for whatever language you choose to use. You're free to use it, but you're not free to use it without consequences. But the consequences during this cancel culture frenzy that went on for a few years were very severe, career destroying and that sort of stuff for the slightest little miscue. Media didn't fight that. They went along with it. And that's really, I thought, sent a bad sort of example for where we might be going when you see that media, being the ones who depend the most upon freedom of speech, were willing to get pretty mushy about it. So right now we're left with librarians, who are the only ones who are still really sticking up for free speech. That's so C, I maybe might even slide it to a D, but I just want to leave room for next year's grade.
Oh, great point. We just finished releasing a report card on finance ministers, so I understand needing to leave room for the next year's grade. To your point, just on purely, not with taxpayers' money going to it, just on the pure free expression element. So the Taxpayers Federation, for example, we often will do stunts that are annoying to people and politicians, even insulting in some ways. We just finished handing out golden pig statues to politicians and bureaucrats who waste money. So free expression from a taxpayer's perspective is essential to our work. If we can't criticize the government, if we can't express ourselves freely, we're in some trouble here as a country. And so this is one of the reasons why the CTF took a stand against things like C11. To your point, though, on the pure journalism element, because this is where I spent most of my adult life, I agree. And for the longest time, it was journalists, at least I found, that always defended free expression, that defended free speech. We've seen overseas, what happened with Charlie Hebdo, for goodness sake. One of my most, closest friends in journalism still has, a magazine cover from that magazine in France. And so I'm wondering where you think this changed. Where did we take a turn to where what you were kind of made me think of referencing? I'm going to be careful here because I don't want to upset people. A few years ago, in the before times, before lockdown, there was a huge cancel culture push that swept through media in Canada, especially on what was then Twitter. And all that had happened was a couple of more high-profile journalists had kind of joked about the fact that now authors aren't allowed to write from a perspective that they are not. Meaning, Jack London couldn't write from the perspective of a wolf, for example, anymore. Or a woman writer couldn't write from the perspective of a man anymore, because that was somehow appropriation. And so a lot of fiction writers were having a problem with this, saying this is a little bit silly. And a couple of journalists had chimed in, basically saying, yeah, this is a little bit silly. And all hell broke loose in their own workplaces. They were attacked by their own employers and had their jobs threatened. And I think we reached peak crazy cancel culture at that point, and it was just a few years before the lockdowns.
Yeah, it was about the mid-2010s. Mm-hmm. I think it started emerging around then, but it kind of coincides roughly with Justin Trudeau's election.
Yeah.
And I think his approach to world affairs and domestic affairs seemed to give people permission to go a little farther than they had been going. I mean, cultural appropriation, there were all kinds of, what do you call them, social misdeeds that people could commit. But it's one thing to sort of criticize people for it, but it was the full consequences of it. I mean, what was that? The kids from the school in Kentucky in the States who had the I can't remember their name right now, but that kind of went viral. And even though, I mean, the main kid in that, I think probably doesn't have to work a day in his life with the settlements he got from the lawsuits he filed, but people were constantly trying to accuse each other. And it was very, Orwellian in a sense. That word gets overused, but kind of Stalinist, where people, or even goes back to the French Revolution when, j'accuse, right? And people there was sort of a terror going on. Ben Mulrooney can probably speak to that.
Yes, he can.
Quite a bit too. And I don't know exactly where it came from, other than there'd been this sort of long march through the institutions that had been going on for about the previous 20, 25 years. So young people were coming out of schools with this attitude. Young people were graduating from university. Not all of them. I got to be careful not to be too sweeping with this attitude. And like I said, the thing that disturbed me the most about media was that it didn't fight it.
Yes.
Right? I mean, the National Post initially threw Rex Murphy under the bus for saying, and if you go online, you can find that column, when he said he didn't think Canada was an institutionally racist country, right? When it's like it even you didn't just, it wasn't like you just had, you weren't able to speak. You were compelled to speak only one thing, right? You had to be in agreement. And the Post initially, threw Murphy under the bus. The note is still on that column online. But then they regained their balance, right? Which was a good sign there. And that gave me a little bit of hope when I started to see that. And some of them you can see are slightly shifting back. But it was scary that they fell for it in the first place, because particularly if they're going to get subsidized for being the defenders of democracy, you better friggin' defend it.
Yeah. So let's take off from there. So I think you've really set the scene well. This just didn't come out of nowhere all of a sudden. This was already kind of growing and bubbling before the money started flowing from government. And I would also, just to throw in, sorry for the inside baseball, but for those of us who've worked in journalism, it wasn't just that. It was a combination of that, of course, this cancel culture frenzy that was sweeping, but also there's just so few journalists anymore compared to what it was 20 years ago. There's just a lack of bodies. There used to be so many journalists, I've told this story many times, that when I graduated J school from BCIT back in the 90s, there were 2 full-time salaried paid reporters, like paying your mortgage level paid, who worked at the Vancouver Sun only on softwood lumber. That's how much journalism we had. So we had City Hall reporters, we had consumer affairs reporters, we had court reporters who went to court every day just to go find a story. And so there's so few of them now, and they're younger and younger and younger, and coming out of these universities with journalism degrees without a lot of experience. So it kind of created this perfect storm for the government to back up the money truck and say, okay, we're going to save you. And now a lot of them, unfortunately, either one way or the other, are dependent upon government funding, meaning they're getting paid by the government. Where do you see this going? Do you see more people cluing into the fact that a lot of mainstream media are getting paid by the government and rejecting them because of it, or is it just a byproduct?
It's hard to say because the mainstream media doesn't talk about it very much, do they?
They sure don't. No.
So it's kind of like their dirty little secret.
Mm-hmm.
So, which means that, to me, that they're embarrassed by it. To be fair, it wasn't the government that went to them that said, do you want some money? They went to the government and said, give us some money.
Yep.
We're the defenders of democracy, blah, 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 which is a lot of nonsense as far as I'm concerned. Just because the Toronto Star or the National Post goes belly up, that doesn't mean that journalism dies. It will find a way, right? Those are merely the vehicles that carry journalism. There are lots of other ways to deliver journalism, and the 21st century is discovering that there are a lot. Like you mentioned, a rewrite. I can go on Substack and read all kinds of good commentary from experts in the fields, not journalism's columnists trying to find expertise in them. I mean, God bless them for that, but I can go straight to the horse's mouth there, for instance. So there's all kinds of different examples of that, but they went to the government. Now, what gets me about that, when you're talking about the decline of journalism, there was a time not that long ago, and I'm kind of at that age where I don't like saying back in the day or there was a time, but I kind of have to do it. I mean, that's what I can offer now. When no publisher, out of their own sense of self-respect, would ever link themselves to government with money, right? I mean, after the Kent Commission in the 1980s, the government proposed a whole bunch of things. The industry stood up on its hind legs, snarled and said, get thee away, Satan, right?
Yep.
Stay away. We would never compromise their independence like that. But just like that,
I know.
They all did this time. So I'm not going to accuse them of pay for play, because there's plenty of evidence of some journalists still doing some good work. The fact of the matter is, though, you're going to have a tough time convincing the public of that. And that's the core reason for it. Once you build an association or a codependence like that, you're going to lose public trust.
Of course.
And they're just not going to believe you. And there's some other practices like the use of unnamed sources, and that sort of stuff, which is very liberally applied these days, which have declined. So there's definitely been a decline in the ethics and the application of what were the ethics of journalism organizations in the past. So going along with that trend you're concerned about, censorship, I'm not sure that we can trust them to defend our right to freedom of speech anymore.
And trust in journalism is plummeting. I read a recent, it was an Edelman survey on trust. It was from a couple of years ago. And trust in I think it was something like high 50%, close to 60% of Canadians believe that journalists are deliberately saying things they know not to be true in order to mislead people. This isn't flubbing something or getting a date wrong or accidentally mispronouncing somebody's name, which all journalists do. It isn't a typo. This is deliberately trying to tell people things they know not to be true. And once you erode trust, that's what journalists bank on. You need your audience to be able to trust your work and what you're saying, because otherwise, what are you doing there? And the moment that you are on some form of government payroll, that shows, again, that is a direct conflict of interest, okay? I'll put it this way. It wouldn't matter if the dearly departed Rex Murphy, okay, were delivering the news, and Don Cherry were delivering the sports. If they're on direct government payroll, that's the problem. It's the perception of bias that destroys trust, because it's a conflict of interest. No matter how much they try to guard against it, it's an inherent conflict of interest, very similar to ethics. The perception of corruption is what gets you. And so this is where, again, I plead with every journalist who's in the field right now who can actually have some influence over their employers, get away from government funding. Do it however you have to, but get away from being funded by the state. Speaking of the state, I wanted to quickly touch on the other side of the vice grip, and that is laws about free expression. Now, Bill C-11 has already been put through the machine. It's working its way through. I sometimes get updates, from the CRTC, which you were also a member of, I will point out. Again, folks, this is why you need to go subscribe to his Substack called The Rewrite, because he's got a lifetime of experience in this. When it comes to the Online Harms Act, though, this is the current new law that is still in play. Now, for folks who forget what it was, it's kind of this double-headed law. One of them was what any normal person would want to do, was to protect young people online from being disgusting imagery being shared, all that stuff. Any reasonable person would say, sure, tighten all of those laws. But there's an element to it about so-called hate speech or online expression of harm or intent that was really alarming a lot of people who value free expression, because it was punishing people for tweets, right? Going back and forth in time. I saw that it sounds like the minister responsible for this is going to be Fraser going forward. Where do you see the current Online Harms Act going? Do you think they're going to split the bill and they're going to get rid of the online censorship element?
I don't think they will, because, well, it depends. I guess it's too early to say. The last government, Trudeau's government, was very susceptible to lobbyists. And the Online Harms Act, and it's had 2 or 3 different efforts to get through, was pushed for. Some of the groups pushing for it a lot were religious minority groups, Muslims and Jewish groups as well, who felt they were being subjected to prejudicial statements online and wanted that to stop and that sort of thing. There are ways, I think, to address those issues, civil actions and that sort of stuff if you behave. But what gets really tricky, as you say, is when you get into this area of hate speech. So do you want to end up where, and this is where I'm concerned about the Carney's sort of connection, admiration for things that are British, is that the rules in England right now, you can get arrested, or you can certainly get visited by the police if you say something that makes somebody feel uncomfortable online, that they interpret it as racist, or that it doesn't even have to be overtly racist. But I am hopeful that they will be practical and they will do things like deep fakes, for instance,
Yes.
turning women into online porn stars like that, that all they have to do is amend section 162 of the criminal code, which is all about sharing of intimate images without permission, to include deep fakes there. Done, right? If you want
Smart.
to protect kids from access to online porn, there are ways you can go about that and work with the online industry on, because there have actually been coordinated efforts. I remember this from my CRTC years, between ISPs, internet service providers, the police, and others, like when it came to child pornography,
Hmm.
for keeping a watch for it. Most of that crap gets hidden below, in the dark web. But they find it, and they where they find it, they seek it out and destroy it, sort of thing. So if you're talking about I guess what we would call mainstream porn, this day and age, finding a way to protect children from that, or at least empowering parents to protect children from it. I mean, my preferred solution is actually having a sort of block that you can apply at home to your
Hmm.
internet,
Hmm.
in terms of that, so that nobody under that age can even access it, let alone get into it. But those are all going to be contentious issues, which I think the government, I think they may address it. They may decide, and a practical decision might be to just clean it up through amendments, as I said, and move on with their bigger economic agenda.
That's where I'm leaning, based on the fact they've now shifted it. Initially, this was under heritage, which was super weird. And now they've shifted it over to justice, which is an indicator that they're getting more serious about it. And I know there's been a lot of advocacy, both from what I would describe as left-wing defenders of free expression. And again, for the obvious stuff, not, against protecting children. Any decent person wants to do that. So there was a big push to split the bill, to get rid of the online censorship element and keep, tightening restrictions on people who seek to harm others, which is already illegal, by the way. Sharing images of child sexual abuse is already illegal. Promoting terrorism online. All of these things are already in the criminal code. To your point, all they would need to do is just amend them that are already in the criminal code. And I know, for example, the Canadian Constitution Foundation was speaking very vigorously against this. So I think because it's coming from kind of a bipartisan grassroots element from both so-called left and right, I think there's a strong chance they will drop that element. So to your point, they can roll on forward. We're out of time, sir. Is there anything else you would like to mention?
Or they
Go
could
ahead.
take a look at Michelle Rempel's bill that I think she has tabled again.
Okay.
She came up with an alternative which addressed some of the concerns, and it's not perfect, but who knows? Maybe they can work with that.
They might, and it is still technically a minority, and governments have absorbed opposition, proposed ideas into their own legislation before. So let's hope that wiser heads prevail. Thank you very much for your time today, sir. Folks, head on over to the Rewrite on Substack, subscribe to it, because of course, Mr. Menzies keeps up to date with the latest on censorship and journalism. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Folks, if you want more original journalism that is independent and thoughtful and hard-hitting, be sure to head on over to junonews.com and subscribe there. Thank you so much for watching. Candice is back tomorrow.
You're watching Juno News, Canada's fastest growing independent news network. Our team works day and night to bring you nationwide coverage of the issues that matter. Honest reporting of the stories that put Canadians first. From far and wide, Juno is doing the work to turn the dial in the right direction, bringing you the news from the field and in the studio. Wherever it takes us, we get the job done. For you and for Canada. Help us replace the CBC. Subscribe today at junonews.com.